They've created this image of themselves as a public-spirited company, so it doesn't seem so outrageous.
Do you think they would get this subsidy if they didn't send money to the politicians or, you know, help finance their campaigns?
I certainly hope the politicians wouldn't do things that crazy for free, but I don't think it's as straightforward as that might imply. There are lots of subsidies, lots of regulations that benefit some companies that I think probably nobody has ever given a contribution for or anything like that. We have a government, both parties, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, who believe that the role of the federal government is to divvy up the national product, to decide, well, we have $6 trillion in our economy this year, how much will we let the people who earned it keep, and how much will we give to ADM, and how much will we give to Chrysler, and how much will we give to Social Security, how much will we give to farm subsidies. They don't seem to have an understanding that that money is earned by individuals and that the people who earn it really have a prior claim to it.
What did you think of the Chrysler bailout a number of years ago?
I think it was just an absolute quintessential example of what's wrong with government subsidies. The Chrysler Corporation couldn't produce cars that Americans wanted to buy. Saw a great cartoon once. In fact, I think Ed Crane has it framed on his wall, my boss at the Cato Institute. It shows Lee Iacocca in a car with a bumper sticker that says, "Buy what America builds." Good old Buy American notion. And a guy in a Japanese car parked next to him with a bumper sticker that says, "Build what America buys." That's what Chrysler wasn't doing. They weren't building what America buys. So they were going to go out of business. So they went to the government. And instead of figuring out a way to produce a car that Americans wanted to buy, they went to the government and they got a $1.5 billion subsidy. And a lot of people think that was a great success. We saved the Chrysler Corporation. We did, although of course they downsized by 2/3 of their workers, so we didn't save very many of the jobs. And besides which, what we don't see, and this is one of the key readings in the Libertarian Reader, is what is not seen. That $1.5 billion that was lent to Chrysler was not lent to you to build a house, was not lent to some other businessman to expand a business that was actually selling things people wanted to buy, was not borrowed by a student to go to college and become a more productive worker. We can't see what didn't happen, but what we do know is that people who were more creditworthy didn't get credit because that money went to the Chrysler Corporation.
Now, if you had to put together an evening's discussion group of libertarians that are in the Libertarian Reader, people that you'd like to have around the table to hear their wisdom on libertarianism in the history that you've known, who would you put? Let's put 5 or 6 of them at the table.
Are you talking about history forever or contemporary?
Just 5 or 6 people you'd like to have at your dinner table to talk about politics and libertarianism.
Well, I'd like to have Thomas Jefferson there. George Will called him the man of the millennium because he enunciated really the concept of the millennium, which is individual rights. So I'd love to have him there. I'd say Friedrich Hayek, who I did have the pleasure of meeting, was a great Nobel laureate, economist, and social thinker, but I certainly would like to have spent more time talking to him. Probably Milton Friedman, who fortunately is still alive, and I do have a chance to talk to sometimes. And I think probably Ayn Rand, who, for all of her foibles, was a brilliant, fascinating, penetrating woman, and I would love to have been able to spend some time with her and see what it was that people found so mesmerizing personally. And maybe, I think maybe that's 4. Maybe I'd take Thomas Paine.
Cato is set up how? Who runs it?
Well, we have a board of directors of about a dozen people. And we have contributors, about 12,000 people who become Cato sponsors and support us financially. And then we have 50 staff members. The president and CEO is Ed Crane, who founded it. I'm the executive vice president. Our chairman is William Niskanen, who was a top economic advisor to President Reagan. And then we have about 10 policy directors who direct our work in the area of constitutional studies, fiscal policy, environmental issues, and so on.
Who of those do we see on a regular basis on television shows?
Well, I think you see Bill Niskanen, the chairman, who talks about economics a lot. Steve Moore, our director of fiscal policy studies, talks a lot about taxes and spending. Roger Pilon, our director of constitutional studies. Jerry Taylor, our director of natural resource studies. Those are all pretty visible. And I think Ted Carpenter, our vice president for foreign and defense policy studies, does a lot of the defense-oriented shows.
Is Doug Bandow?
Doug Bandow, yes. He is not a policy director. He's a senior fellow, but he does a lot of writing for us. So you see a lot of op-eds by him, and he does a lot of TV appearances.
I ask our folks to put the names of your board members on the screen so that the audience can see who supports this. How much? Let's take a look at who they are. There's Peter Ackerman of Rockport Financial Limited, K. Tucker Anderson of Cumberland Associates, James Blanchard III, Jefferson Financial, John, is it Blocker or
Blocker
of Woodside, California, Frank Bond of Holiday Health Spas, Gordon Kane of the Sterling Group, Edward Crane, who is your president, Richard Dennis of the Dennis Trading Group, Theodore Forsman of Forsman Little and Company. Is that Ethel May?
Ethel May Humphreys
of the
Tamco Asphalt.
David Cook.
Coke.
I knew I'd get that wrong. John Malone of Telecommunications, Inc. And William Niskanen, David Padden of the Padden Company, Howard Rich, U.S. Term Limits, and Frederick Smith of the Federal Express Corporation.
I think one common thread of the people, I mean, in general, the people who are on the board, other than the two staff members, are significant financial contributors, people who help us raise money as well as giving some themselves. I think one common theme running through there is they're entrepreneurs. You don't see very many presidents of Fortune 500 corporations. These are people who have built their own companies. They have a sense of the dynamics of the free market. John Malone really helped to build TCI, the big cable company. Fred Smith is probably the best known, the founder of Federal Express. Ted Forstmann is a venture capitalist, which sort of means that he funds entrepreneurs to get businesses off the ground. And some people here may have heard of Howard Rich, who runs U.S. Term Limits. He is also a businessman and investor, but U.S. Term Limits has been his big political interest recently.
What was the thing that Richard Dennis funded a couple years ago?
Well, Rich Dennis has funded a lot of things. He is a generous contributor to Cato. He is also a funder of the Drug Policy Foundation. He's very much in favor of reform of our current policies of drug prohibition. He's a commodities trader in Chicago. He's also an active Democrat, so he's funded a lot of Democrats.
There was something else he funded, either a media organization, I can't remember.
Well, if your memory goes way back, he funded something called the Roosevelt Center for American Policy Studies, I think was the name. Funded that quite generously, and that organization is no longer around.
How many of those board members are members of political parties and active?
I don't know. I suppose half of them probably. Rich Dennis, as I say, is an active Democrat. I think Ted Forstmann is an active supply-side Republican, a fan of Jack Kemp and Steve Forbes and people like that. I think probably several of them are Republicans, and a couple of them have been or are in the Libertarian Party. Actually, David Koch was the Libertarian Party's candidate for vice president in 1980, which was, you know, the only way you can give a large amount of money to a minor party. Turns out there's all sorts of ways to give a large amount of money to a major party that we didn't know about.
Have you ever sat around the table and listened to those people on that board talk about politics?
Somewhat, yes, sure, at our board meetings.
What's their number one interest?
I think their number one interest, I think it's broad. I think their number one interest is individual liberty, and so that goes into a lot of areas. That's why they're on Cato's board instead of some organization that only does one issue. But I suppose if you insist on narrowing it down from the concept that they really do believe in liberty, I'd probably say economic growth. They're very concerned about overtaxation, overregulation, overspending, and what that's doing to the prospects for growth. You know, we used to grow at 3 or 4% a year in this country. It doesn't sound like much. We used to grow at 3 or 4%, now we grow at 1 or 2%. But it's the difference between doubling your standard of living in 15 years or 30 years or 70 years, and that makes a big difference. And I think that we shouldn't be growing as fast as we did in the 1950s. We should be growing faster. We have more rapid technological improvement. We have global markets now. I think the fact that we're only growing at half the rate we were then is atrocious.
In your book, you talk about the post office, and that, as a matter of fact, you've got Fred Smith there with FedEx. You don't think much of the post office.
I don't think much of large, gargantuan bureaucratic monopolies. That's right. You know, we have an antitrust division. We talk all the time about competition and monopoly, and if two companies merge, will that be a threat to competition? And then you've got this huge part of the economy, communication of ideas, and it's run by an 800,000 person government monopoly. Now, what's happening, of course, is that increasingly all important communications are going through Federal Express or UPS or through electronic mail. So even though the Postal Service has a legal monopoly, it's losing